Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. I wanted to take a few minutes to respond to this point with regard to the myth, and the way that I'm using myth here is that it's an account which contains, in this case, a partial truth with regard to the overall reality. Did the printing press cause changes? Yes. Did it lead to the corrosion of tradition? No. The reality that we find when we start talking about, for instance, Maktabatul Halabi, that is located uh, in the Azhar precincts, right around Al Azhar Masjid, Al Azhar University. The printing of those books that were considered to be the bedrock of the Azhari curriculum was overseen by ulama, by scholars that served the purpose of correcting and editing and so on and so forth. And so, if anything, what the printing press did was that it alleviated students from having to worry about what edition text they were going to get, what edition text they were going to get, and it reduced the cost of having to have someone handwrite or hand copy a text from beginning to end. That was a costly process, and it was not without its mistakes. It was not without its issues. The education system at this point uh, didn't transform. And what I mean by that is that the philosophy of education was still one in which the teacher was centered. So even if you had books that were typesetted and there was a duplication of those texts never eliminated the role of the teacher. That philosophy of the teacher, the student, and the book has remained till this day in the seats of learning, right? But it was accompanied, or it was complemented by, or at times it was competed against by the modern system of education, which required the classroom, and it required a certain understanding of the book and a certain understanding of pedagogy. Pedagogy meaning philosophy of learning and communicating information. If anything, the printing press helped in many ways. It is what helped preserve a lot of text, and this is where people come in and they say, well, it was destructive, and I've heard this argument put forward by Dr. Abdul Hakim Murad and some years ago, and some of what he had ascended to, in terms of what he reached as a position, is something that he, alone, yani qawl al-fard, he alone has that position. The reality of the situation is that any scholarship of any worth understands that the books are not an end in themselves, and that's why we sit in the halaqat of ilm, right? In the hilqa of ilm, we sit in those circles because in those circles the teacher will compare between texts, will correct them, still even books that have been printed, will add on notes and so on and so forth. And the philosophy has always been يعني العلم هو ما في الصدور وليس ما في السطور. And so the concept has been that knowledge is that which is contained in the hearts of the scholars, and not that which is in the books that are written in the sentences that you find on a page. because it is scholarship, living scholarship, which brings that to life. That doesn't mean that the book doesn't have any role, or that an advanced scholar can't take any benefit, or that a intermediate student can't benefit. But definitely, it does mean that the beginning student is not in a position, or those who are reading beginning level books, they're not in a position to navigate the text. And that is much different than the concept of education that we have in the West. You know what I'm saying? Even in the West itself, there was a barring of the concept of reading. And so when you look at Yale and Harvard and those places, they used to talk about, I am reading. And what they meant is that they're reading to the teacher. The role of the teacher, even up to recently in the Ivy League schools or the Ivy League circuit schools, the role of the teacher has still remained extremely important. And that's why they were very resistant to online education, right, in the Ivy League school system, extremely resistant to online education because they would take away from the philosophy. And in fact, you're talking about places where even the advances that we find in pedagogy or educational techniques and philosophies as a discipline, specifically in the West and maybe even in the East to some extent as well, you're talking about places where they still may even have chalkboards. And we talk about Ivy League schools, they introduce, the technology that is used or widespread in a lot of educational circles late on because of their, holding on to that philosophy. So the printing press didn't destroy the effort. What happened was the philosophy of education began to change by way of colonization. And the Muslim community itself began to have a certain conception of scholarship, looking down on the techniques. And because the mind had changed, the Muslim mind had changed, and what they considered to be logical. There was a lot of criticism against the Gaddafi himself. He used to talk about the corruption of the mind that was caused by the yellow books, and what he was talking about was uh, the books that of the scholars, because they used to write on yellow paper or they used to be printed on yellow paper. A lot of the books that people call tradition texts. El Maududi, he understood this problem, and that's why in the four terms or the four concepts, he introduces to the professional crowd that he's trying to deal with and bring them back to Islam so that they won't be swayed towards Western philosophy or even a lot of the Marxist thought which began to dominate in the Indo-Pak subcontinent or the Indian subcontinent before all the borders and everything. He has a paragraph or two in which he says that the Quran is not written in a style which you're used to in the texts that you study in other disciplines. Because what began to happen was that now a certain type of writing and a certain type of presentation of information became dominant, right, by way of the educational systems that were coming in, and the way that they were using the printing press, and so the Muslim mind began to change. And so that's where we especially start to see more and more a focus on the whole idea of thematic tafsir of the Quran, although it's not something that is a modern, phenomenon. It was done in the past, but it was not. The emphasis wasn't placed on thematic tafsir of the Quran. To look at the surah of the Quran or the chapter of the Quran by themes, that became important because the modern mind, the way that the modern mind began to look at things, began to want things to be systematically ordered in a certain way. And even that is not anti-traditional because if you look at uh, even if you look at, for instance, the writings of people like Ibn Rushd and others, that's how they were organizing their thoughts, right? And so it's not accurate to say that the printing press destroyed, or corroded tradition. What happened was the educational systems began to change, and what was given value was one educational technique over another due to economic and political reasons, people. You know what I'm saying? And so those, who would say that, what is it that they want? They want people to return back to handwrite their books in the Quran. That's a beautiful reality. But to engage in that as the way of revival solely is problematic. Why shouldn't we benefit, from the technology? But what we should have an understanding of is the philosophy of how it's employed and the impact that it has on our understanding and our minds. And this is exactly what El Maududi tried to do when he was writing in the Four Terms. He tried to explicate to Muslims that were Western educated or they joined leftist groups that were dominating in the subcontinent, that they had to be aware of the fact that their minds had been shaped in a certain way and that they had to acclimate. And Sayyid Nursi did the same thing. Imam Sayyid Nursi Bedou's Iman, um, one of the ulama from the late Ottoman Empire, he did the same exact thing, right? Al Johari did the same thing in his tafsir. But Sayyid Nursi understood that there were some problems that were coming with Western philosophy and Western education, and he wanted to address that psychology and that mindset. And so the reality of the situation is that the elimination of the teacher is what has done this, but that is by choice of the Muslims. You understand what I'm saying? The printing press is not the victim, and it's not the criminal. You know what I'm saying? But it's actually the victim in this reality. It's the Muslims themselves that began to incline in different directions, in which they began to eliminate the need for Mashaykh and others, and they began to assist the colonial process and dismantling the role of Islamic scholarship. Because Islamic scholarship, you will find that there's two tendencies in it, or if not three. There's that retrogressive tendency, there's that status quo tendency, and there is that tendency that's ijtihadi, or that tendency that's problem solving, and it moves to accommodate, and all within what we would call the boundaries of what scholarship looked at in the past as being scholarship. And so what we choose out of what is so-called tradition says a lot about us, right? And so when we look at, for instance, walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And so when we look at the situation of what people have chosen to be the main books that they study from, you find that they're using contemporary printed books, and they study certain books, right, that were written for a certain time period, have nothing to do with compatibility with today's mindset. And so then they don't even bridge, in explaining what is the role of a mukhtasar, what is the role of a primer, and why is it that in madhabi fiqh, or in certain books, certain disciplines, I'm sorry, there's a certain way of looking at the book, and why are certain books chosen over other books. None of that is talked about. You understand what I'm saying? And so the reality of the situation is that no, the philosophy of education has changed. As a matter of fact, if anything, Imam Ibn Khaldun was very critical of the direction that book writing itself was taken before the printing press, and he criticized some of the choices that scholars were making in the way that they were dealing with books and the production of books, and he saw it to be detrimental. So, for instance, to constantly build a system of education that's only based on abridged versions or small text, which require a language which is extremely concise and closed in order to communicate a lot of points. In other words, say a lot with a little. How do you accomplish that? That's a difficult feat. We consider that to be one of the miracles of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But to use that as an academic standard would mean that now you have to learn how to use an almost encoded language, and that encoded language has to be decoded, and that decoding process takes place in explanations and commentaries and glossaries and so on and so forth. And so Imam Ibn Khaldun, he bemoaned how that was detrimental to education. And what it did was it created an environment in which there was a disconnect between the real purposes of education and having to invest all your time in decoding what the scholars were saying. So you're trying to figure out what is it that he's saying, and you put so much time into that versus what is the goal of what he's saying. And so that shows in and of itself that the problem of the book was happening way back when, and the printing press, what was, I won't say was neutral, so to speak, 100%, but what some people have been bringing up, and and I've heard it in multiple on multiple venues, is not completely accurate. The question more is how could it have been better used? you know, and the reason why a lot of these arguments are constructed against things like the printing press and so on and so forth is to argue against modernity and to argue for a concept of Isnad and Ijaza, which really doesn't exist except in mythology. If you want a concept of Isnad and Ijaza to exist, then build the educational system that will create a relationship between the students and the teachers. And so the same people that consume this type of stuff and produce this type of stuff, these types of arguments, and consume these arguments, are benefiting from you know uh, the electronic mediums that we have now, such as online lectures where in reality you don't have a teacher. You're listening to a conversation that you're not really a part of. And so if you don't have the skills to decode that conversation, it's the same problem as the printing press, that you've done away with having to have a teacher. And that's the problem in Islamic education, is that people want to bypass the process that we have. Imagine the deen coming to us, being beamed down directly, into the hearts of men, and not having a prophet and not having Jibreel alayhi salam, right? And so, what kind of deen will we have in that regard? The deen came to us by way of Jibreel, who came to us to teach us our deen, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sent, as a person, as a human from among us, to teach us, versus Jibreel directly coming to teach us without the medium of a prophet. And so there's reasons why the relationship between the student and the teacher exists. What would be of a portion of the Sunnah if it wasn't for the fact that the Prophet ﷺ watched the companions internalize the teachings of the Quran, and so internalize his communication to them of the Quran, his explanation. And so the companions, what it was that they did, that they demonstrated their knowledge. They had opportunities for what we call contemporary educational philosophy performance. So we have Sunnah Taqririyah is predicated on the idea of the student demonstrating before the teacher that the student has internalized the lessons, right? And so with that said, the teacher student relationship is extremely important. And that is what was eliminated, in many respects, or was deteriorated, not by the printing press, but by the change of psychology, which came along with colonialization, and which came along with imitation, of those who had colonized the Muslims. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.